Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting us and for giving us this very rich experience. On a caricature of the older view of the relationship between human nature and human rights, there was an objective human nature, there were objective needs and interests grounded in our animal and rational natures, and it was in these common natures that our common human rights were somehow based. The task one faced then in addressing a society other than one's own, in addressing people whose moral views were other, was to point them to that common nature and show how it grounded these moral claims. Principles were universal, what was local was their application. In the background was a form of moral realism in which the view was that the universe, not human sentiment, determines what is right and good. And for the moral realist, of course, if the universe is on my side, it will naturally be opposed to those others who disagree with me. Many problems were identified with this over the years with this project. One of them was mentioned earlier today, namely that it appears to commit the naturalistic fallacy, the mistake Hume is supposed to have identified, though, as was also mentioned earlier, it's in dispute whether this is in fact what Hume was meaning in the passage in question, when he said that one ought to be careful when one sees people moving from oughts to ises, and the thought is that this somehow confuses facts and values, the true and the good, and that one should not make that mistake. Well, after 2 centuries of Humean philosophy in the Anglophone world, we're now being urged from many philosophical directions to give up this fact-value distinction and accept some form of moral realism again. And on many modern moral views, moral facts are in as good shape as other kinds of facts, though they may be different from them. But the debates about realism, about the true and the good, the debates about these questions, I think carry no special weight in the context of a dialogue between the West and the rest, or between, say, human rights and Asian values, because if the naturalistic fallacy is a mistake, then the old caricature humanist argument was a bad foundation for belief in human rights, even within the West. It has nothing to do with where you are or who you are. There is no special problem about Asian values or some other form of alternative picture. They're all going to be wrong if they make this move, so this move has can be of no use in adjudicating among such views. But the problem I want to raise for dialogue across societies about human rights arises even if moral realism is correct. And if the position I just caricatured as the older humanism had ever seriously faced other societies, that is, if the people who are rightly caricatured in that way had ever faced the other societies, they would have had to contend with the very untheoretical problem that I want to talk about. Now, I happen to believe there is such a thing as a human biology. I think there's a biological human nature. Of course, there are individual people who, for one reason or another, don't instantiate some of the traits, and so on. I mean, what it is for something to be the nature of a kind has a complicated relationship to issues about what individual members of the kind have to be like. But I'm happy to sort those questions out. And I think it's obvious to me that a good deal of what that nature is shaped by the fact that we have the bodies we have, and that we live in the environments we live in, and that those bodies and those environments together produce a way of being that's characteristically human. And furthermore, it seems to me that there are central events in human life, like what T.S. Eliot called birth, copulation, and death, which are in obvious ways reflections of that biology. They're shaped by that biology, and they're very important for human life. So I don't think what's wrong with the older argument is the appeal to a human essence or a human nature. I don't think that actually was a mistake. The problem that I want to talk about, the problem that becomes clear in real cases, is that the many interests people have in virtue of this shared nature don't function outside symbolic contexts. So we don't give birth to organisms, or we do give birth to organisms, but what we really give birth to for human purposes is kin. We give birth to sons and daughters. We give birth to people who are also the nephews and nieces of our brothers and sisters and the grandchildren of our parents. We give birth to people who are born conceptually into ethnicities. They're born into religious traditions and so on. And when we copulate, I'm just going through birth, copulation, and death here. When we copulate not with other bodies, or not just with other bodies, but with people who are lovers, spouses, but also sex workers and all kinds of other people. But they're all socially located. They all have identities when we interact with them, even in this most bodily of ways. And finally, the end of the organic life has a meaning that depends crucially on all kinds of questions. For example, is the end of the organic life the end of life? Or is there a life beyond? That makes a big difference to how you think about death, surely. But also on questions of value, like, do you have the notion of a life that is in some sense completed? Do you have the sense of a life that ends well? And that'll make you think about different deaths differently. On the other hand, some people think that, as it were, all death is terrible. I think most of the people who think that haven't spent time with a very old relative, but still, there are people who think that all death is terrible. So a shared biology, a human nature, doesn't give us, in the relevant sense, a shared ethical nature. And once you enter into a genuine dialogue with people who hold views other than your own about these matters, you're going to discover that there's no non-question begging way of settling on the basic facts, whether moral or non-moral, from which to begin to discuss. There simply are no guaranteed foundations. This is a point about actual conversation. This is not a philosophical point about whether foundationalism is correct in these matters as a philosophical matter. This is about how conversation goes when people meet each other across societies. And it does no good here to say, with the old school moral realist, that whether we can persuade people of the correctness of our view of the good is a separate issue from whether the view is correct. Those are indeed different questions, but that is just a theoretical issue in the context that I'm thinking about. It's an issue for philosophers. In real life, in these real debates, judgments about right and wrong are intimately tied up with metaphysical and religious belief and with beliefs about the natural order, and these are matters about which agreement may be difficult to achieve. It is, for example, hard to persuade people on the one hand, people over here as it were, that there are no electrons, and on the other hand, as it were over here, that there are no witches. I have friends who couldn't be persuaded that there were no witches, and I have friends who couldn't be persuaded by anything at all that I can think of that there are no electrons. And the trouble is that real dialogue gets stymied in the circumstances like these because people who disagree at this level are likely to treat the conversation as it were, merely hypothetical. It's not really, I'm not going to have a serious conversation about what life could be like if there weren't any witches, if actually I know that my Aunt Victoria is a witch. Right, this will be a purely hypothetical conversation, and I won't engage it with the seriousness that I would engage a conversation that took for granted what I do seriously take to be so. And the result is that if you take up dialogue across substantial gaps of belief and experience and imagination and desire, you end up unable to find real agreements at the level of principle, and more than this, you'll often end up failing to agree not just about principle, about what we ought to believe or do, but about what we ought to believe, but about what is to be done here, now, in this particular case. Practically speaking, however, we don't need to resolve disagreements of principle about why we should, for example, save a child from drowning, if in fact we agree that the child must be saved. But if I believe that the child has been called by the ancestors, and you believe and you don't believe that, then it's not clear to me that there's a lot to be said in the way of conversation. So I want to suggest that there was something wrong with the original picture of how the dialogue could be grounded, It was based on the idea that we must find points of agreement at the level of principle in human nature. Here is what human nature is, here is what it dictates. And I think what we learn from efforts at actual intercultural dialogue, what we learn from travel, but also from poems and novels and films from other places, to drag in the humanities, is that we can identify points of agreement that are much more local and contingent than this. We don't actually need to find agreement at the level of principle. Actually, it's quite hard to find such things, but fortunately we don't need them, because we can agree, in fact, with many moments of judgment, even if we don't share the frameworks within which those judgments are made, and even if we can't even identify a framework, even if there are no principles articulated at all. Bernard Williams once said, I thought wisely, that he was clearer that it was wrong to torture an innocent child, more convinced of that than he was of any theory about why it was wrong to torture an innocent child. And indeed, if you met someone of whom that wasn't true, you should be worried about them. I mean, you should be worried about their reliability. So to the extent that we have problems finding our way into narratives or neighborhoods, they can occur just as easily with narratives and neighborhoods around the corner as they do with those from far away. Many of my agreements about human rights I share with friends in Delhi and Accra and Johannesburg and Hong Kong, and I disagree with people in the small town of Pennington in New Jersey about some of them, where I spend some of my time. Now, Cass Sunstein has defended what he calls incompletely theorized agreements in the context of American constitutional law. And I'd like to propose a similar freedom from the demand for high doctrine in the development of the internal practices of international human rights. We should be able to defend our treaties of human rights by arguing that they offer people protections against governments and that most of their citizens desire, and that are important enough that they also want other people, through their governments, to help sustain them. Once we seek to defend these rights in this pragmatic way, we can appeal to a highly diverse set of arguments. Perhaps some rights, to freedom of expression, for example, are not only necessary for the dignity and the maintenance of respect of the people who have them, but also helpful in the development of economies and the stabilization of politics. And all of these are things that are wanted by most people everywhere. Most people want their economy to develop. They want stable politics. They want to be treated with respect. To make this pragmatic point, to argue for basic rights in a way that's receptive to a metaphysical ecumenism, and frankly a scientific ecumenism as well, an ecumenism about anthropology and sociology and biology as well, but responsive to the moral vocabularies we find on the ground, is not to hold, as some of us suggested, that the foundation of the legitimacy of human rights is the consent of a majority of our species. After all, our most fundamental rights restrain majorities, and their consent to the system that embodies those restraints doesn't entail their consent to the rights themselves. Otherwise, there'd be no need of them. If consent is an empirical notion, then most Americans do not consent to many rights that we actually have. For example, probably most Americans don't consent to the right to marry even if you're condemned for a capital crime, but you do have that right under American law. The remarkable currency that human rights discourse has gained around the world demonstrates that it speaks to people in a diversity of positions and traditions, and this chord of resonating agreement explains why we can find global support for the human rights system, grounded in a million different vocabularies. So one reason for articulating these ideas in international documents, which are widely circulated and advertised, is just to draw attention to that core of agreement, however narrow, and to help to give it practical force. We needn't be unduly troubled by the fact that metaphysical debate is unlikely to yield consensus, because human rights can, and therefore should be, sustained without metaphysical consensus. Thank you.